sources of energy, any attempts to stay between the 1.5 degrees of warming target will be futile. Strong action and political leadership is needed now to avert the worst implications of climate change for both current and future generations. The growth of the so-called far right at EU level threatens everything. These elections are a pivotal moment for the future of the EU's climate policies. The concern for us here is more than that youth voices are being ignored, is that reality itself is being ignored. Is that intimidation of vested interest have succeeded and that true leadership is on the way to losing all meaning. So to let you get on with your event today, I leave you with this. This quote sticks out to me and has, remained with me throughout my activism career. And that is, when the last tree is cut and the last fish is killed and the last river is poisoned, maybe then you will realize that you cannot eat money. Thank you very much.
That's the Lorax, if I'm right, Anya, is it?
It's great.
Thanks very much. And it is really, really useful to be reminded of the clarity with which the youth climate strikers posed what we already knew, but we're not paying attention to in 2019. And of course, really interesting, of course, that you now have the vote, all of you. So it's great to hear your voice again now at this most urgent moment. Okay, so I see a question in the chat. I was going to type an answer. I'll answer it before I introduce the candidate panel, which is, did we invite all European election candidates or just a selection? No, we did not invite all 72 or something, whatever the answer is now. We invited a representative of each of the 7 political parties in the Dáil that voted for the climate law and have candidates running across Ireland. And 5 of those took up our invitation. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were not in a position, didn't, despite numerous requests, find a candidate with diary space to come. And then based on gender, geography and polling, we were looking around at other candidates too, and on that basis we invited Clare Daly, independent MEP for Dublin, to come as well. So that is how we got to a panel of 7 or 6, I think we have now. Anyway, I mentioned Clare. Let me introduce the rest of the panel and we'll come to the first question. So we have Brian O Boyle from People Before Profit, who's a candidate in the Midlands Northwest. Sinead Gibney for the Soc Dems, who's a candidate in Dublin. Aodhán Ó Riordáin TD, who's a candidate in Dublin. Senator Lynn Boylan from Sinn Fein, who's a candidate in Dublin, and O'Sullivan MEP, who's a Green Party candidate in Ireland South. And I think that's everybody. So thank you all again for coming. So we decided we'd start off with a lead question, which is because obviously so much of politics is about prioritizing. So if you are an MEP in the next Parliament, what is the one climate policy in Europe that you would push or lead on? What do you think would make the biggest difference? What would be biggest difference? What would be your top priority? And I'm going to start with Senator Lynn Boylan. And my colleague is going to put a clock up, I think. I'm not sure if that's visible to all of us. They use it for me in team meetings, and now we're using it for you.
I will keep it in the time, Oisín, but if someone can give me a flag if I go over. And look, thanks a million for inviting me here today. I suppose, look, when I was an MEP between 2014 and 2019, I completely focused on climate action and biodiversity. And my intention would be, if I was lucky enough to be elected again, to do that. I've also spent the last 4 years in the Seanad focusing on climate, and I've spoken 200 times on climate justice, and I have 3 pieces of legislation currently pending in the Seanad as well. So look, if I had, I suppose, to focus on one particular area, I think what we see a lot of the time around climate is there's lots of good intentions, there's good laws have been brought forward, but a lot of the time it relies on either individual measures or market mechanisms. And I think the key thing that we need that would across the board when it comes to climate action and fairness is tackling the corporate interests that are out there. We know that the European Union is the second most lobbied institution in the world next to Washington. When I was an MEP, I tried to ban fossil fuel lobbyists. We didn't get the support of the other political groupings at the time. I currently have a piece of legislation that would ban fossil fuel lobbyists in Ireland. But I think we we need to tackle those corporate interests and the influence they're having on all of those progressive policies. We've seen when I was an MEP on the single-use plastic, I was the one who exposed the fact that repack were undermining that particular directive in 2019 and trying to water down the targets. We're seeing the same now with the PFAS regulations. So it is essential that any MEP going out there isn't just going to, I suppose, focus on the Climate Committee and the body of work and legislative work that goes there. They also have to tackle those corporate interests that are working behind the scenes, both at the Commission level and at the European Council level to government representatives, because that's what repack did on the single-use plastics. They lobbied our government so that the Council position was being watered down, whereas the MEPs were very transparent about what their positions were. So I think that's key to it. I would like to see the likes of the bill that I have in the Sinead on the banning of brand new items. So tackling again corporate interests, the likes of Amazon, your big designer brands that are perfectly legally able to dump brand new unused products rather than resell them or donate them or even recycle them. I would also like to focus on trying to ensure that at an EU level, because what the current government and the Green Minister is telling us why they won't adopt my legislation here is because they want the EU to move as a whole on this, and yet we know that the EU are only planning on tackling textiles. They're not planning on going after IT equipment, laptops, iPads, all of those things with finite resources in them. So therefore, if that is the case, why the Irish government won't move on my legislation, I want to bring it to Europe and make sure that we tackle it on an EU-wide basis. So I still got time left, or have I used
and I'm very generous. If you want to stop after 3, I prefer 3 minutes. That's fine, Lynn.
Well, I might just mention one other thing of where an example of tackling corporate interests again is the case I'm taking against the Irish state on the Energy Charter Treaty and calling on the Irish government to exit that treaty, because again, that's the fossil fuel industry being able to hold governments to account and sue them when their profits or future profits are affected. It's not fit for a post-Paris Agreement future. And I suppose, again, it's just another example. That's my track record as both an MEP and a senator, is taking on these corporate interests and trying to fix it from a systemic level rather than always going after the individual when it comes to climate action. So, Sinead.
Thanks, Lynn. Bang on time. And I'm going to hand over to you now, Aodhán. Same question.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation, and thanks, Anya, for the presentation beforehand, which I think affected us all. I've got 2 daughters, one who's 6 and one who's 6 weeks old, and I'm extremely conscious that I want to be able to look them both in the eye in 30 years' time and to say that I did as much as I possibly could have in my own political life to hand over to them something that's sustainable and livable rather than what was handed on to us. So you mentioned, Anya, the rise of the far right, and it's partly the reason why I'm running in this election, the racist riot that took place on the streets of Dublin on the 23rd of November. And I realised then, and I realise now, that far right activism isn't just about anti-immigration sentiment and racism. It goes hand in hand with climate change denial. And you can see worrying signs across the European Union about the moves to the far right. It is impacting on parties here in Ireland, unfortunately. You can see some government and opposition parties moving to the right on immigration. If they move to the right on immigration, they'll move to the right on climate action as well. It's something that I'm watching very, very keenly and I'm worried about. And on the European level, we have Ursula von der Leyen, who's the president of the European Commission, who's holding out the hand of negotiation to far right groups in the European Parliament, and they will be aligned with Fine Gael. And she is reneging on the Green New Deal. She is willing to have conversations with far right groups, and they are not just anti-immigrant, but they are climate change deniers. I've been asked to pick out one thing that I want to focus on. It's hard to pick on one, actually, because I'm speaking with Professor Mary Murphy from Maynooth University. She said we don't talk enough about the inequality of this conversation, that the top 1% of earners are consume 6 times the amount of carbon than the bottom 50% of earners, and that our inability maybe to talk about inequality in this whole space needs to be challenged. We need to talk more about income inequality when it comes to issues such as just transition. But if I was to pick on one thing, it would be transport. And I don't want to be an MEP, with the greatest respect to my colleagues, who isn't visible or isn't obvious to Dublin politics over the next 5 years. Huge amount of work is done in the European Parliament, huge amount of work and negotiating is done in Brussels and Strasbourg and elsewhere. But I think your MEP has to be a relevant political voice in Dublin for 5 years. And going around different constituencies and communities, I can see the outbreak of culture wars happening in individual areas and communities around transport links, around cycle lanes, around sustainable infrastructure. And I think we've actually gone back. And I think we're actually regressing in terms of what I thought was a fundamental basis of understanding of the scientific issues of the nature of climate change, of how these issues are prevail us all, and the necessity of action. And I feel as if we're slipping on that. So what I would like to do over the next period of time is to advocate for things like free public transport. It can't happen overnight, but we can it happen in stages. Getting people out of their private car, to advocate for new transport systems in Dublin, and not to be somebody who is remote to Dublin politics, but central to Dublin politics. Because, as others have said, there are very, very loud, vocal lobbyists who will say, something, not now, maybe tomorrow. But the action that needs to happen is now. So what I've mentioned, there's other things I could mention around data centres and the inequality I've already focused on. But the transport issue in Dublin particularly, I think, is one that we have to show political leadership on. I'm worried about the lack of political leadership on it. And I certainly think that would be the mission I would have for the next 5 years, to deprioritise the private car and to incentivise those who, when they get up in the morning, the first choice that they make would be public transport or the use of their own bike.
Thanks, Aodhán. And I'm passing over now to Sinead Gibney, who's the Soc Dems candidate in Dublin. I'm repeating that for those who've just joined. Thanks, Sinead.
Thanks, Oisin, and thanks to Friends of the Earth for hosting today's event. It's really great to get this so close to the election. I think a lot of the hostings were a little further back, but it's great to get this discussion going at this stage where we're right in the thick of it. And I think, it is, of course, a very hard thing to do, to pick out one thing. And I think, unfortunately, firstly, to say the next 5 years are obviously just incredibly crucial for climate, and that makes our mandate, should any of us be elected, we will play a huge part in the protection of our climate, the protection of our planet, and the necessary steps that are needed to protect it. So I think for me, because of climate denial and poor action and unambitious targets, we are in a situation where, for me, reaching climate neutrality has to be the absolute goal here. And that means greenhouse gas emissions reduction and moving our energy system completely. So obviously we had 55% was the 2030 target in February of this year, 90% target by 2040, which would bring us to climate neutrality by 2050. So my priority would be to introduce rapid emissions legislation and keep emissions targets in line with scientific data, and to bring forward that 2050 climate neutrality goal, because I think that is really, unfortunately, the only way we can tackle this. And unfortunately, we've lost the opportunity, I think, to face into it with more innovation and with more choice around how we might tackle it. So that, for me, has to be the absolute priority, is the reduction of greenhouse gases emissions and reaching climate neutrality sooner. And but I, like everybody else, I'm not just going to pick one. I'm going to choose a couple more just things to mention within that I think are absolutely crucial. And just transition, for me, is also something that I think is absolutely crucial, because we have to bring everybody along with us and make sure that the inequality we have in our society is not further deepened by the climate movement. And the other thing alongside that I think is really, really crucial, and Ánya's contribution brought it to mind, is the protection of civic space. Because I think at the moment where we're seeing so much attack is on the ability of people to really fight for climate change effectively and safely. And we have to protect that. Our laws have to be upheld, and we have to maintain the democratic system which allows people to fight for climate change and to use whatever activism is going to work. So I think that, for me, really is where the focus needs to be. And thanks again. Look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Sinead, and for your succinctness too. So I'm handing over now with the same question, which is, what if you were pushing one thing, what would it be, to Clare Daly MEP for Dublin? You're on mute, Claire. Claire, can you hear me?
Hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello? You hear me now? Yeah?
Yes.
You can hear me? Sorry about that. Okay, sorry. And listen, thanks a million for organising the initiative. There's no doubt about it. The crisis of climate change is the biggest catastrophe facing humanity, and it has to be the #1 priority for all of us. I think we saw in the last election certainly a mandate for radical green change. But what we got at the end of the mandate, to that, the Green Deal had a lot of promise, while some deliverance of emissions and climate action, the whole area of nature and biodiversity was absolutely gutted over the course of the mandate. And I suppose people make a lot of promises when they stand for election. I'm standing on my record on this issue, and myself and Mick Wallace scored highest out of all of the Irish political parties in terms of our commitment to the environmental files across Environment 800, as indicated and verified by all of engineering. It depends on it. I think that the whole area of nature itself and sustainable pesticides resolution was dropped. The whole area of the nature restoration law was dropped. The whole area of sustainable food strategy needs to be revisited. But if there was one thing that particularly,
Claire, you're breaking up a little bit. Do you want to turn off your video?
Area of militarization, which is being not back. Hold on, I'm so sorry about this. Is okay, but work better.
Without the video should work better. Yeah,
is that any
fire
better?
ahead.
No. Is that better?
Yes.
No, I'm so sorry about this. I'm trying to make it fit in. Look,
fire ahead. You're talking about militarization.
What the of the military. We know that militarism is more damaging the nation and shipping. Yeah, you know, I go now. No, can you hear me?
I think
you can't hear me at all. No.
No, keep going. I think it was stabilizing just at the end there. There's a lag. Go for it.
Yes, yeah. No, look, militarization absolutely not factored in. The footprint of that is greater than aviation and shipping put together, and yet nowhere is that factored in. We see the last mandate, Ursula von der Leyen's commission have taken money out of the STEP program for research into alternative climate action and put into defence instead. That's absolute lunacy. I think that is one area that has gone to be debated more as we were in the dying days of the last mandate, and I think that's something that absolutely has to be factored in. It seems to stand of turbocharging defence, so I think that area needs to be factored in. Absolutely, just transition as well, and the other points about corporate sectors. I'm conscious that I've messed up with your clock, and I'm so sorry for the signal, but yeah, we see it as a huge priority for us, and we're really proud of our score on all of the files. We should be cognizant that the MEPs are dependent on the legislation that the Commission brings forward. We can't initiate any legislation without them, and we need to be realistic about that. And on areas like transport, we have here as well. I've done a lot of work on sustainable aviation fuels and so on. But ultimately, there's big pots of money sitting there in connecting Europe. Ireland has been 25 out of 27 in not accessing that money for public transport. That was a failure at national level. Many countries have free transport. You don't need the EU to do that for you. I think we need to be mindful of our mandate. Thanks, and sorry for the interruptions.
Thanks, Claire. No worries. No, we got most of that. Don't worry. And now I'm going to hand over to Brian Ó Boyle, who's the People Before Profit candidate in Ireland Northwest.
Yeah, thanks very much, Oisin. Thanks to Anya for sharing your thoughts with us, and thanks to Friends of the Earth. I'm probably the least known candidate, so I'll just say quickly who I am. My name is Brian Ó Boyle. I am a first-time candidate. I'm an economist, and one of those rare economists that actually moved to the left the more I learned about the world rather than to the right. And in terms of the last maybe 15 years or so, I have sort of led in the background in People Before Profit on the climate question. I teach some courses at undergraduate level on sustainability, and I was asked a few years ago to write the climate action plan for the party, which I did. So that's by way of introduction. Lynn is absolutely correct about the need to take on the corporate interests, because ultimately they've proven singularly ineffective and unreliable partners in the greatest challenge we face, right? These are empirical facts. And I think, just to be very concrete about what I would do if I had a sort of magic wand approach, first of all, the EU has fundamentally moved away from democratic spaces towards privatized spaces. And that's not, in all areas, that's probably more true in energy than anywhere else. So we've had, historically there were nationalized energy companies, and now most of those have been privatized. And so it becomes more difficult to manage the climate crisis, considering that energy companies are still the primary drivers of emissions. And now they're based around stockholder, shareholder value and profit making, as opposed to the common good and long-term sustainability. So that would be one. And alongside that, I think you would have to scrap the whole idea of carbon trading and move towards the idea of a just transition, as other people here have said. I mean, there's obviously a self-selection bias here, because we're all committed to broadly left-wing ideas. We're all broadly committed to the idea that the corporate sector has polluted the planet in the interests of profits. And then the question becomes, what do we do? And I suppose, taking up what Aodhán said, I think it's an important point, right? Because I think in the end, what Claire did there as well was important, where we broaden it out a bit from just the specifics of an individual policy. Because to my mind, mainstream politics has failed to convince people that there is a transition that's just. They failed. Over 30 years ago, we knew there was a climate crisis, and we've learned more and more about it scientifically. And yet there's more and more fatigue, skepticism, cynicism about climate action, because nobody has actually delivered serious ways of tackling it in a collective way that's just and has a fairness attached to it. So increasingly, we're asking ordinary people to do things, and the corporate sector gets off scot-free. So I think that's the fundamental thing I would say. Like everybody else, if I was to bring in a few other issues, I'm in Midlands Northwest, and I think it's important to just give a shout out to farmers, small and medium-sized farmers who are very cognizant of the need, most of them, to have climate initiatives that would actually work to protect the environment. But they're also really squeezed by a low value amount in the chain for them. So they're not getting enough of the value of their product. And in that context, they're then being hit by a massive amount of regulation, which they find almost impossible to deal with. And it becomes a sort of zero-sum game for them. Can I afford to engage in my climate action, or will I actually have economic security? And we on the left have to be able to say farmers need both. So to summarize what I think in the end, you're going to need radical structural change of the whole European project. That's what I think. And I think without that, what we really get is climate theatre. And we get a lot of speeches, we get a lot of people making commitments, but those commitments invariably get broken. People see that it's, as someone else said, it's consistently about individualistic solutions rather than collective actions. And in the end, it's designed to allow the corporate sector to continue to pollute. So I think those would be my big priorities. And finally, obviously, a just transition means a more equal Europe. And so actually, you need to strengthen trade union rights.
Thanks.
You need to make sure we have more equality across the board for people, and that will help us to get the just transition.
Thanks, Brian. And the last person to answer the first question, which is what's your main priority for the next 5-year period, is Grace O'Sullivan, Green Party MEP for Ireland South.
Thanks, Oisin, and thanks, Anya, for your words. And you reminded me, I remember when I joined Greenpeace at the age of 21, and we used to read the speech of Chief Seattle exactly on the lines of what you read out. Like, there's no point in having a heap of money in our pocket if we have no fresh air, if we have no clean water. So, you know, that is, like, I often call it the ABCs, Ds. The A is air quality, B is biodiversity, C is climate, and D is disarmament, you know. And they're the kind of principles and values that have led me through my years as an activist with Greenpeace, and then very reluctantly becoming a politician and running for election and being elected into the Senate in 2016. Since and this is just one thing I want to refer to before I get going on what I would prioritize. Lynn, who did absolutely superb work when she was in the European Parliament, I have to say. But one thing, you talked about the Energy Charter Agreement, or the treaty. We voted in April, this April, the EU is withdrawing from the Energy Charter Treaty. A number of countries have already done it, and we're hoping that by May we're out of that. And the other thing on the PFAS, so what they call the forever chemicals, I was the negotiator for the Greens on that, and we got a ban on that in the legislation, the packaging waste regulation, over the last few months, and that will come into force in 2026. So some things are actually happening and underway. My priority areas as the chief negotiator for the European Parliament on the Environment Action Programme to 2030 is to keep the measures that we've got, keep the momentum going. I absolutely cannot tell you how stressed I am, how frustrated I am at the lack of overall progress. I've been working on the climate issue since 1986, when we went to Antarctica with Greenpeace and started to become aware that the glaciers were melting. So it's not happening. It's no longer warming. It's heating. It's happening at a huge rate. My group in the Parliament, which has some real experts in this area, are trying to drive the boulder uphill, not only in the government in Ireland, but also in the European Parliament, because and more so now than ever, because Ursula von der Leyen and her EPP colleagues, and along with Renew, there is a definite push away from the Green Deal. It's disgusting. It's unbelievable that someone at that level, the head of the Commission, gave assurances to the public, to yourself, Anya, to all ages, all generations, also to industry, that we were going on the green pathway. And now she's rowing back at a speed of knots, and it is absolutely unacceptable. So as the rapporteur, the chief negotiator on the Environment Action Programme, the key priority areas were climate mitigation, climate adaptation, circular economy, zero pollution, protecting and restoring biodiversity, and reducing production and consumption footprint. So again, these issues have come up, but these are kind of the overriding framework for me, and these are the area that we have to keep pushing. And all I can say, Anya, is I've been pushing this agenda since I was your age, and believe me, I get so worked up and so frustrated, because now I'm not only myself the activist, I have 3 daughters, so future generations. So we cannot give up hope. We have to keep courage, and we have to keep pushing the agenda. So fossil fuel subsidies, gone. That's in the Environment Action Programme. It says
time's up, Grace.
So anyway, that's a bit of my story. I'm looking forward to the rest of the debate. Thanks very much, Oisin.
Thanks, Grace. And thank you all for being so good with the time. It does give us a good chance to get through some of the questions, which I'm now going to try to do by turning to the Mentimeter. There is a question on LNG that I'm going to come to in a minute, but I'm hoping to try and do one quickly here, because the second highest question with the question with the second highest number of votes is one that actually you touched on, Sinead, already, about targets. So this is a question that says, will you support the European Commission proposal for at least 90% emissions reductions by 2040, which is a recent proposal from the Commission for 2040, and push for net zero well before 2050? So I'm actually going to ask, I'm hoping to do this one fast. Can I have a show of hands here? Are you all in favour of the European Commission proposal that reductions by 2040 should be at least 90%? grand, and that the net zero should be before 2050 for Europe. That Europe needs to get there before 2050, sometime between. Okay, I'm going to leave that for now. You can come back to it if you want to say whether it should be even more ambitious or something. You can come back to it in one of the other questions. But it is good that we have all the candidates and political groupings represented here on the record as being in favour of the European Commission proposals, which will be one of the key decision points during the next Parliament. Will be those targets for 2040. Okay, now the question that has topped the poll, so to speak, in the Mentimeter is one about LNG. This is a question that has had a European dimension at times, because there was projects around LNG that were in the projects of, I forgot what they're called now, common interest or whatever, that were being given special treatment. But the question is the following. Shannon LNG recently put in an application to onboard Penola for a 600 megawatt gas power plant in County Kerry. I'm going to read the question, then I'm going to comment on one thing. There is no longer a moratorium on LNG. What will you do to stop LNG in Ireland? The case is actually that as of now, the moratorium on LNG infrastructure is still in place. It has not gone, but the government has indicated that it is examining the idea of using LNG as a backup gas supply in case Moffat, the link to Scotland, was actually interrupted by either terrorism or accident. They're actively looking at a floating LNG terminal as a backup supply. So, but as of now, the moratorium is in place, but it's a live issue across government, we understand. So you're being asked, what's your view on that, and how would you stop LNG? And I'm going to come, I'll come to you again first, Lynn, because I know time is up. You have less time than the others.
Oh, no, well, I was only putting my hand up to say I didn't mind answering this, but I don't mind going first.
Go ahead, sure.
Look, I suppose the issue of LNG, I've long opposed the gas terminal at Shannon, and I think that what we need to focus on, apart from not locking ourselves into a fossil fuel future, is how do we reduce our demand for gas overall? And I think that's something that's certainly been lacking from the government's priorities. They've no plan for a demand reduction. We saw that we didn't reach those targets, the voluntary targets that we signed up for when the war broke out in Ukraine. So that has to be a key priority. I know it's a national issue, but we have to have a strategy around reducing the demand. And that, of course, means tackling the connections of data centres, particularly islanded data centres, because we have a situation where the minister, on the one hand, is saying no new data centres should be connected to the gas grid. And for Gas Networks Ireland saying, go ahead, we're legally obliged to connect them, and don't worry because we'll change the fuel in the future. So those two things don't align. But we also need to change the mandate of Gas Networks Ireland and Bord Gáis so that they are in compliance with the Climate Action Plan. So I think certainly we don't want LNG. We don't want to lock ourselves into a fossil fuel future. But the counter argument from those who are in favour of those is always around energy security. And the problem is the current direction of travel from the government around gas demand is making that case stronger by the day, because it makes it harder for us to reach our renewable targets. So we have to have that gas demand strategy, and we absolutely have to oppose any lock-in to fossil fuel infrastructure into the future, because even if the Energy Charter Treaty is gone, there's a 20-year sunset clause on that. And as I said, I've commented in the comment section around Eamon Ryan is still challenging my High Court case. He's defending the government's position of remaining a member of the Energy Charter Treaty. So long as that's hanging over us, we do not want any permanent new fossil fuel infrastructure.
Thanks, Lynn. And I'm going to go to Brian next, but actually I see a question in the Mentimeter that's very linked. You actually touched on some of this already, Lynn, which is basically the fact that many different European political groupings vary greatly on what they say in their manifestos about phasing out fossil fuels more generally. So I'm going to link the specific question about LNG to that. And Brian, if you want to talk about both, and Lynn spoke for just under 2 minutes, so I'll try to keep everyone to that.
So you're asking me to speak on the LNG, and what was the other one? Sorry,
the more general phasing out of fossil fuels and your approach to that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll start with that more general one. I mean, I'm struck by the point of reaching targets, because I do think targets are important because they give some accountability. But there's also a negative side to the targets, I think, because when you talk to younger people, I talk to them around the college, they become quite cynical because they see targets that are constantly missed. So every year we have one less year to achieve what we have to achieve. And every year the climate emissions go up. And people just see that and say, well, is anybody serious about these targets? So, you know, behind the targets, we need effective action. And that, I think, comes from more than just setting targets and hoping that mainstream politicians will suddenly change tack. They haven't before, and I don't think they will again. The second thing I would say in general is that you know, you should separate the technical from the political. Technically, right, it's becoming ever more possible to have a renewable energy grid. It's becoming more and more possible that we could have an economy, a modern economy rooted in renewable energy. And there's all sorts of obfuscation then from the oil and gas industry. For example, they say things like gas is the least damaging of all the fossil fuels. And they say we can't have any form of transition without an increase in gas and all the rest of it. And I don't buy any of that. I don't think that's true. So we're very proud in People Before Profit that Breed Smith has led the way in the Dáil in trying to ban the LNG system, partly because of fracking, but also because, as Lynn says, it locks us into a long-term fossil fuel future. And I think, you know, we have had one big success in Ireland across. I know Ireland is a laggard in terms of its emissions, but the big success has been wind energy. 20 years ago, we had negligible amounts of wind energy. Now, about, I think, 39 or something % this year, something in and around that, will come from renewable energy. And so if we were to sort of prioritize the needs of families, the needs of small and medium businesses, let's say, and not have, as others have said, the data centers gobbling up a lot of energy, I think it's possible to move. So to summarize, I think a transition to a renewable energy future is possible, but it's not a technical problem, it's a political problem. And in Ireland, I think that's evidenced by the fact that so few of the mainstream politicians want to move away from the LNG stuff.
Thanks, Brian. I'm going to come to you next day on the same question, both the general phase out of fossil fuels and specifically on LNG.
Yeah, well, I agree what's been said about LNG, and on the wider issue, I mean, you know, Brian's quite right in the previous comments he made that the reason that, you know, we're all here is that we are signing up to this agenda. We feel as if all of our political parties feel that this is an existential crisis that it has to be central to national and European conversations over the next 5 years. I'm in Leinster House, I'm a TD. I see how, I mean, what's been said already about the assumptions that we all had maybe 5 or 10 years ago, the importance of this issue, the scientific basis of where we're going. You know, all of these challenges that we faced, I assumed that there was a general understanding of where we were going. There wasn't a pushback politically in Ireland. I thought we were possibly, you know, better than that. And unfortunately, I've been disappointed because there is a rump of independents who will wind up this issue, who will create climate skepticism. Sorry, it's a difficult word to say. In different parts of the country, and they are running the table at the moment. It would appear, and they're also impacting on government policy. But again, I go back to the issue of the income inequality and who is being asked or feels or perceived as if they are carrying the burden, and how much of this can we liberate in terms of people's lives and their experiences? How can this transition to a fossil eliminated future and genuinely have a vision for people to grasp on? Because I do think it's far too easy for people to cling on to the past, to talk about the glory of the past, the simplicity of the lives in the past. And this is all part of a culture war that people are utilizing for their own short-term political gain. And it's a worry. And it is the other side of the coin of the anti-immigrant, far-right, anti-equality agenda that I see creeping and creeping and creeping. So I would also say that it's not actually enough part of the national debate. It's not really part of the central to discussions that we have day in, day out in national politics, and that certainly needs to change. But if we don't do it, if we're not better than the other side of making the case, not better about talking not just about the doomsday scenario, but why it is important to have a vision for change and for the future and for our children and for our planet, then the table, as I say, is run by those who want to drag us back, who want us to stay still, who want to deny the science, and who want to toxify this debate. I mean, it's one thing to toxify the planet, it's another thing to toxify the debate. And unfortunately, I feel that they're winning. And I'm really worried about the results of these elections as what's going to happen, not just here in Ireland, but across Europe. So we've got a body of work to do.
Okay.
And I think collectively, all of us, it's not just down to the Labour Party or the S&D in Europe, but collectively, all of us here have a responsibility to coalesce more and to cooperate more as political parties to make the case.
Okay, thanks, Aodhán. And I'm going to go to you now, Grace, on the same question. One on LNG, and you might, given that you are a representative of a government party, and I know you're the only one here who's a member of a party that's in the government in Ireland. This question around the LNG is specifically of relevance, I guess, to you. We in Friends of the Earth don't think a floating offshore LNG terminal is the best way to provide a backup for Moffat, if a backup from Moffat is really required and necessary. But you might want to comment on that, and what's your view on what should happen there, and on the broader question of phasing out LNG, which is a more European specific or general question.
Yeah, Oisín, if I can come back from an EU perspective. So the Green Group, we had huge issues with the whole, you might remember what they called the taxonomy regulation, and projects of common interest, where public funding would be given to keep fossil industries going, you know, and propping up gas. So we oppose that, and the financing of these projects and using public money. My own perspective, and I speak very regularly to my government party colleagues, is that we have to invest as much as we possibly can, not only from what we can afford to do from the state, but also from investment from Europe, from industry, wherever we can, into renewables. So into renewable energy, clean renewable energy, you know. So on that basis, I will continually put pressure to that we do not enable the very fuels that are absolutely accelerating climate change. And I'll keep pushing on that, because for me as a Green, that's what I believe, that's where our voice should be used. And that's what I do with every opportunity I can get. And that we push, like Brian was talking about the renewable, the opportunity, you know, like there really is opportunity there. Why aren't we delivering at scale? Because we've had parties holding us back. Now, you can think what you like about the Greens. You can say what you like. But the one thing is, we know the problem. We have tried to push the investment, the enabling legislation. So when I was in the Sinead with Aodhán back in 2016, we were trying to push open the legislation so we could at least start the process to develop offshore wind, which we know is going to offer its great potential. Okay. So and that's why I'm going to use the word again. It's an uphill struggle. And I'm here amongst what I would call kind of like-minded people today. And I'm kind of sorry, Oisín, that you don't have some of the other parties on here, that we could have a really rigorous, tough debate. Because, you know, that's where the problem is trying to bring all the actors on board.
We did try quite hard to get, well, very hard to get someone from either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael representing EPP and Renew, and I think they tried, but they didn't. You know, they didn't make it as much of a priority to be here as we would have liked, because they aren't here. Okay, I'm staying with this question of LNG and fossil fuel phase out, and I will come to a question on farming next, just to looking at many people, just to look ahead for a second. I'm going to go to Clare Daly next, and then to you, Sinead, and then you'll be near the top of the third round. So over to you, Clare, on LNG and fossil fuels. You're on mute.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? I'm so sorry about this. This is a nightmare. Look, I'll be brief. The question was specifically on Shannon LNG and that, and it was more a nationally based question, but certainly when we were in the Dáil, and my colleague Mick Wallace, where the LNG would be located, has been very vocal on this issue. We're totally opposed to LNG. We're completely in favour of the fossil fuel phase out. But I do think we need to look at this in the European context, where in the current mandate, we've had the reopening of coal in Europe in this mandate. It's absolutely catastrophic that in response to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, the European Union responded by cutting off the supply of Russian gas. On the one hand, you could say, well, that's good. It is a fossil fuel. We know that. But without the replacements being in situ, we saw American liquefied natural gas coming in at massive, enormously high environmental costs of that. We also had, of course, as I say, the reopening of coal mining. This is catastrophic. And we see the European Investment Bank is there. It's supposed to be the green bank. We haven't had adequate infrastructure and investment in renewables. And some of that is down to the choices of government. There's not a single Irish project that's in place there. We have unique wave energy, which could be developed and which people have been crying out since my time in the Dáil to harness our unique resources, particularly in terms of the Atlantic. We've done precious little in that regard in terms of investing renewables. And the truth is the direction in which the Commission is going is to move away from using that bank as a green bank into a defence bank. So I think we're coming back to the days of Greenpeace, that you can't defend the environment now without being anti-militarisation as well. And I think it's directly linked to the two. We need investment in alternatives, and we certainly, the points made about data centres and so on that Lynn made are absolutely relevant as well in terms of demand. But the question was a little bit national specific. Obviously, I'm not in the Dáil, but when I was, we were very vocal on that. And certainly at the European level, we have continued to oppose LNG as a really insidious development environmentally.
Thanks, Claire. And finally, on this round, Sinead, both the question of LNG as a gas reserve and the more general phase out of fossil fuels and how we go about it.
Thanks, Oisín, and I'll keep it brief because I know we want to get on to more questions, but I just certainly agree with the LNG responses we've had so far, but also to highlight that in our 2024 alternative budget as a party, we set out a 5 billion climate transformation fund that we believe is necessary to get us to that renewable performance and to do so in a way that maintains social cohesion. So I do think, sadly, government investment in this area has been severely lacking and continues to lack, despite any pressure they might be getting within government partnerships. I think at a European level, in terms of that fossil fuel, some of the measures that I would specifically set out, and very much in line, as we've all said, I think with the same approach that people are talking about here, but opposing public money at state and European level for infrastructure that would lock us into further fossil fuel dependency. I think we also need to see greater regulation of the financial industry within the EU so that money is not flowing to support the fossil fuel industry. I think there was recently published research showed that European banks have provided more than 300 billion of financing to fossil fuel and agribusiness activities in the global south in the years since the Paris Agreement. I think we need to support the EU endorsement of the need for a global fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, and I would be pushing for that as an MEP. And supporting the principle of polluter pays. So those are just some of the specifics that I would be pushing for at MEP level. And as I say, as a party, we promote the idea of a substantial 5 billion climate transformation fund, which I believe at a domestic level would assist with that renewable push.
Thanks, Sinead. And before we move on to the next question, because you were so efficient, I have time to ask you this follow-up, which is that have the Social Democrats decided what party grouping or political grouping they will join in the European Parliament if you are one of your colleagues is elected? Just because
no, we haven't decided that. We have not decided that yet. I mean, and just for the benefit of everybody here, we have not yet had an MEP. We're a young party, just 10 years old. So I suppose our position is that we will wait until we see what the results are for the election in terms of our own success, but also the group of MEPs from Ireland who are returned, and then also the groupings themselves. We will be looking at obviously close alignment of our policies with any of the groupings that we assess for membership. And that will be along the lines of absolutely climate right up there, but also immigration is one where we're seeing some shifting within the groupings that are causing major concern for us. So that will be the kind of criteria that we will be looking at. Okay,
thanks for that. The next question I really like, and it was not one we offered to the Mentimeter. It's come from someone in the audience and has had a really good response, because it's about farming, but it's put in this way. who in the European Parliament, or who among us all, but who in the European Parliament is best placed to have difficult conversations with farmers that face transitions because of the impact of climate change and the impact and the needs for climate action? And will you be supportive of that, or how would you approach those conversations with farmers, both as an individual politician or speaking about the political system more generally, perhaps? And I just want to pair that, just to bear in mind, it's mentioned down below how there's been rollback in the last, or some of you have mentioned already, on the biodiversity strategy, the nature restoration law, the pesticides regulation, and the loosening of CAP rules around agriculture. So that's been where the noise is recently. So you might want to just, again, a bit like the 90%, confirm that you would not be in favour. You are in favour of the strategy on the nature restoration law and regulating pesticides. But the heart of this question is, how do we talk to farmers about their difficult transition ahead? And I'm going to come, because I know you have to leave. I'm going to come to you first, Lynn.
Yeah, and I think this is, if we can crack that nut, Oisin, we would be in a much better place. The problem I see with a lot of the conversations, and I include the media in this, is that they look for the clickbait, very divisive, polarizing topics. And they don't want to actually get into the nuances and the proper conversation about how do we bring the farming community with us in the same way. How do we bring disadvantaged communities in the city? I'm running to be an MEP in Dublin. Doesn't have too many farmers. There are some out in North County Dublin and some in South County Dublin, but not very many. But what I see all the time is a polarization of the conversation, and it doesn't serve anybody. We know the farmers have been very badly led by both national policy and by the EU policy over the years, and told to go big or go broke. And I really think that, one, most farmers, when you talk to them, I don't get to talk to too many of them, but when you do talk to farmers, is that they want to make a living. They want to be able to put a roof over their head and to pass the farm on to the next generation. So how do we create the framework where that is actually sustainable and financially viable for them? But it's really difficult to have those conversations with some of, again, the corporate interests in the agricultural world as well have a really divisive effect in terms of the conversations. Where you talk with farmers directly, they're very different to some of those corporate bodies, in the same way when you talk to individuals directly in the cities. So look, I just think that, particularly for the media, and this goes for a lot of the topics that we're seeing in this debate, the media have to be responsible. And that's not about silencing or censoring, but they have to be responsible about how they're framing arguments and not be focused on getting the clickbait. And actually, let's have the conversations, because there's nothing going to be achieved if you have the environmental sector over in one corner, farmers over in another corner screaming at each other, and never the twain shall meet. So what I would like to do is to be able to, I suppose, bring people together. But I do think it doesn't help when you have the media trying to polarize the debate constantly.
Thanks, Lynn. Thank you for that. And I'm going to go to you this time around, Sinead, to vary the order.
Thanks, Oisin, and absolutely, I will be supportive of these conversations. I think, as Lynn has said, I really do think we all have a part to play in having difficult conversations with farmers, with disadvantaged neighbourhoods, with our children, with everybody in our lives. And I think I would just call out our own party leader, who is a farmer, who has entered politics just 5 years ago from her own background as a farmer, and she represents part of the farming community who I think are just not depicted in these media debates that Lynn's describing, where there are so many within the farming community who want to see this change, who are eager for it, but who have livelihoods to protect, families to support, and who need to be brought along. So I think, our policies certainly are informed by that representation that Holly brings, and I think that's something that I will be bringing to the Parliament myself as well.
Thanks, Sinead. And I'm going to come to you next, Grace.
Yeah, thanks, Oisin. Listen, one of the really frustrating things about these debates is they're way too short, and there's so many areas I want to cover. So in terms of the farmers, my father was a dairy farmer, so that always gives me a little bit of a ninny with the farmers, because he was a member of the IFA. Surprise, surprise, I'm sure you're shocked. But all of his life before he passed away a few years ago. So I've always had, I'm growing up in Waterford, and I've always had a good relationship with farmers, even though we have very different views. but I always sit down and always have when I was in the Shannon and in the Parliament. Now, a few things on the biodiversity nature restoration law. I absolutely saw red when I saw other MEPs from Ireland going to vote against it. I know I really heavily influenced Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael to vote for it. And as Lynn knows, I was utterly shocked when I saw Chris going against it, Chris McManus, and I don't buy the arguments. I think we could. It's really important we keep nature restoration on the line. The other thing, I brought in the legislation, first time ever, soil legislation into the European Parliament in 2019 when I was the chief negotiator on the Environment Action Programme. There was no legislation on soil. As an ecologist, a trained ecologist, I see all the benefits and the importance of soil in terms of flooding, nature, restoration, biodiversity, and all of that. So I think it's really important. And on that basis, I am disgusted that Ursula von der Leyen, that they pulled the sustainable use regulation of pesticides, because the only ones profiting here are the big agri companies that are selling, the agrochemical companies that are selling these pesticides, because in the end, it's going to destroy nature. We have to find other ways to farm. And then, and one last thing, can I say, Mercosur? I mean, that's the one area where any of us can work really strong with farmers, because we in the Green Group, we are absolutely, utterly opposed to the Mercosur trade deal and undercutting the farmers and the whole carbon footprint of bringing food over from South America.
I saw Lynn nodding on Mercosur. I'm going to you next, Aodhán, and then to you, Brian. So you can feel free to mention Mercosur in your answer on farming too.
Yeah. Well, I do agree on Mercosur, and our candidate in Ireland South, Niamh Horgan, has been very clear on this. I don't have farming in my background. I think my great grandfather possibly grew up on a farm in Cavan, but I'm not sure. So I can't pretend to have links with the farming community. But I do know about I suppose negotiation or speaking uncomfortable truths to people. I've tried to do it in the drug sphere. I've tried to do it in education. Sometimes speaking to people with respect is something that it can be a difficult thing to do. And nothing is ever black and white in life. I know sometimes you like to say it is, but there are a lot of nuances. When I became a school principal, actually one of the best bits of advice I ever got was that regardless of the route that you have, as long as there's a child at the center of what you're trying to do, as long as there's the benefit or the dignity of a child in the center of your argument, well, then nobody will ever question your integrity. And I think when we're dealing with any industry or any sector of Irish society, as long as there's people or humanity or the human condition at the center of your argument, well, then they can't question your integrity. And I think far too often, various different lobby groups, and I have to say the farming industry is not well led. I think some of the very personalized political statements by the likes of the IFA are really regrettable and don't help anybody, really don't help anybody. And I would challenge them to have a proper discussion, which is actually based about the future of all of our families, of all of our people, of our collective humanity. But that at the centre of what we're trying to achieve, then maybe we might have a meeting of minds. But it can't come back to old digging trenches and old stereotypes. The last thing I say is that I am hoping to be a member of the S&D group. And the S&D group is the second largest group in the European Parliament. The Labour Party is aligned with the S&D group. We haven't had an MEP for 10 years. So if I was to be elected, I would certainly be a member of a particularly powerful group in the European Parliament. And I think that would benefit Ireland and benefit us in this entire discussion, which I think is very, very, obviously very, very important, because I'm here and agreeing with Grace. It is a real shame that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, with all the candidates that they have, which is much more than the Labour Party have, because we've got three, all the candidates they have haven't bothered to show up for this debate today.
Thanks, Aodhán. And now, Brian, you have three Fianna Fáil candidates in your constituency. And it is Midlands Northwest, where there's a lot of farming. What's your experience like, and you can answer the question more generally, in having conversations with actual farmers as you look for votes in this election?
Yeah, it's been very, very interesting, and I like the question. And I think Aodhán said about uncomfortable truths, and I think it's important to listen as much as it is to tell people the uncomfortable truths, because farmers have a lot of wisdom and they have a lot of knowledge about what needs doing. And when you listen to them, at least when you listen to the ones who are really committed, you learn more than you actually give in information. But what they tell you is that there's an existential crisis for farmers, and it has two parts. The most immediate part is that farmers often can't farm anymore. 1,000 farmers are leaving the industry every day. That was a statistic they gave us at the hustings. 9,000 farmers have left the industry in Ireland since 2016. Only a fifth of farmers can actually farm full time, and a third are over 65. So when you talk about existential crises, they initially hear, we are in crisis. We have an enormous crisis. And then you say to them, well, we want you to take up the burden of climate initiatives. And they say back, well, what about the oil and gas companies? What about the airline industry? What about the big agri sector? Why are you asking us to be the sort of, the bearers of all of this regulation when it's clear to us that the bigger players in the industry are not doing very much? So I think the left have something to say to the farmers. I tried my best to say it to them. And I said, listen, I'll give you 3 principles. The first one is we listen and include you. And all too often, rightly or wrongly, they do think the Green Party have tended to regulate over their heads. And that's, I think Grace will maybe accept that that's their perception, whether that's what she feels is actually happening. So they feel that the Green agenda becomes a zero-sum game where they have to pay. And we've got to try and get the idea that actually, if we had more fairness and equality in the agricultural sector, more food sovereignty, more listening to farmers, we would then unearth their ideas about how we protect our rivers and our land and our industry. So I think that's one big one. Second one is we need to reform CAP so that more of the money goes to the small and medium farmers who are on the front line of climate emissions. We need to do that because otherwise most of the money reinforces the market inequality where the richer farmers get more of the money. They're more committed to the productivist model of as much as possible. Most farmers want to live a sustainable life, both financially and environmentally, but the big industry wants to make as much money as possible. It's a different model of farming. So the CAP should actually reduce the inequality rather than reinforcing it. And the last thing is the value chain. We need to accept that farming has evolved so that the big players are at the input stage and at the processing stage and the retail stage. They're squeezing the farmers' value chain. And until somebody stands up for the farmers and says, if we want you to do the environmental initiatives, here's how we're going to make sure you have financial security. And that's the key thing. So I think if those 3 things were done, if the left can get that across, we're trying to get that across to them, we'll be in a much better position.
Thanks, Brian. And lastly for this round, and there'll be one more question after this because I'm conscious of time, and it'll be a short question. Claire on the farming.
You're muted again, Claire.
Yeah, you're still on mute, Claire.
Yeah, no, it's on my phone. Can't actually see anything with it until I speak, and then the thing comes up. I'm so sorry. I think the way we deal with farmers is that we listen to them. Now, I was on all farming protests, and it's absolutely true that there's not just one problem that they're facing. They're facing multiple problems. Yes, they're bearing the burden of the green transition, and that just transition has to be addressed. But actually, their real problem, because we have no choice, have to deal with the green agenda. Where we have flexibility is in terms of our trade policy, unfair competition coming from the likes of Mercosur, the monopolistic supermarkets who are not giving farmers value for money. They are things we can address, but we can also enable farmers to make their transition, because like everybody else, they have to do it. And it's really regrettable that the current Parliament rode back on what were already incredibly weak provisions in terms of nature. I mean, the biodiversity end of the Green Deal was absolutely filleted. And it is regrettable that Sinn Fein and one of the independents voted against the nature restoration law, the CAP simplification process, which was also voted and supported by Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Sinn Fein, literally filleted any of the environmental considerations in terms of CAP. And that's just not good enough, because farmers do want to work with nature. We know that. And sustainable pesticides regulation, the sustainable food strategy law, which were dropped, that's the wrong approach. They weren't giving out about the environment. They want a healthy environment which protects nature as well. So I think you deal with them by listening to the different nuances, accepting where the problems come from and explaining a more just solution for their issues. But instead, the Parliament and the EU has gone the opposite direction, and we need to steer it back. Biodiversity and nature has to be at the heart of the Parliament for sure.
Thanks, Claire. So I'm going to try and squeeze in one more quick answers and a quick question from the Mentimeter to take it to the international level. There's a question in the Mentimeter: will you prioritise the EU's pledge to climate finance and to the loss and damage fund? So this is basically, financial flows from the global north to the global south, both to cope with climate, to help them do their emissions reductions, and now after the decision in the last United Nations COP to establish a loss and damage fund to compensate them for the climate damage that has been caused by our historic emissions in the global north. So will this be an issue that you would seek to raise in your time in the Parliament? If you're elected, I'm going to come to you first, Aodhán, this time, and I'm looking for less than a minute in this case.
Yeah, I'm going to have to run, but the answer to that is yes, and I think absolutely it is irresponsible and hypocritical of the EU to have any kind of a conversation around an EU migration pact, for example, without addressing the reasons why there is migration, and a huge part of that obviously is political instability, but it's also climate change. And it is wrong of the European Union to have any sort of a common migration discussion or pact without that. But the answer to the central question is absolutely yes.
Great. Thank you, Aodhán, and thank you for your contributions. I'm going to come to you next, Claire, on this one. You're off mute. So
to my phone again. I'm probably still. I'm off. Oh, brilliant!
No,
right, okay, and I'll be short. So, yeah, look, this was a key priority for our group at the COP negotiations. Mick Wallace represented our group at them on numerous occasions. It was absolutely key for the left group, and we would certainly consider that. Look, I think anybody can promise anything at an election. I think you have to look at the record and on all of the environmental files and reports we've led and agreed with the organisations and such a key part of it. So absolutely.
Great. Thanks, Claire. And I'll come to you next, Sinead.
Thanks, million, Oisin. And likewise, absolutely would support it for both. I mean, Ireland and the EU need to contribute to their fair share. And I think the EU scheme needs to be a more permanent scheme. It should be on top of the official development assistance, because otherwise that will be diluted. And these need to be grants, not loans.
Succinct answer. Brian, next.
Yeah, you won't be surprised to hear that I fundamentally agree. We're also in the left. We will be in the left party if any of our people before profit TDs are elected. I would urge Sinead to have a look at that, because I think, historically it has been the left that have really pushed these issues as hard as they can. I think it's a no-brainer. It's a really nice question because it kind of encapsulates social justice and the climate, and you can't do one without the other. Europe is saying that it's the leader now, that it has reduced its emissions by 31% over the last 30 years. But that's emitting from that the idea of Europe's carbon footprint, because many of the heavy industries have moved off to Bangladesh or to China, and the goods come back into Europe. So if you look at it that way, Europe actually still has a much higher standard of living, much higher capacity to take climate action, and should be taking more than it's doing.
Thanks, Brian. And lastly, Grace.
Yeah, goes without saying, loss and damage, it's hugely important. Eamon Ryan, whatever you think of him, he really led out on this at COP and really got recognition for the really important work he did in that regard. The one thing in terms of the groups in the Parliament, like the Green Group, in terms of loss and damage, climate, nature, social justice, just transition, has been consistently the party in terms of gender equality. All the legislation, every proposal, resolution, whatever comes through, we put it through a set of criteria to make sure it's fair and balanced across the board. And just, Brian, you were talking about the Carbon Adjustment Fund. So we legislated to make sure that any products that are made outside of the European Union, now they have to pay an adjustment fund, a carbon adjustment fund, if they're coming back into the Parliament. So what I want to do is keep pushing the really good legislation we got over the line. There is a kickback. We know that. We know Ursula von der Leyen and the whole Commission has indicated their strategy going forward is not at all where we should want it to be in terms of climate justice and social justice. So that's why I've put myself forward to try to get back in again.
Thanks, Grace. And in a minute, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Serka, who is our head of campaigns, to just talk a little bit about other things that Friends of the Earth is doing or encouraging and promoting over the next 10 days between now and the elections. But firstly, I just want to thank all the candidates for giving us their time and their thoughts and their analysis, because I have to say, I think it was a very serious and rich discussion. So I thank you all for that, and thank you to all our supporters and the members of the public who came for your questions, and because the questions that came from you, they're not just the ones we thought of beforehand, and I think that question on farming in particular was an interesting angle to take, and and prompted some really interesting responses from our panel. So thank you to the panel. You're free to stay to hear a little bit about what the rest we're planning, but I'm conscious you have busy schedules if you need to go. So thanks to those of you still here, to Brian, Sinead, and Claire, and Grace, and also to Lynn and to Aodhán, who were here earlier. So we very much valued your time. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to you, Serka, now to tell us about what else our supporters can be doing in the next 10 days.
Yeah, no, and I just want to say thanks to everyone as well. It's been great to organise. Like, I think if we think back to the beginning of today around what Anya was saying, and maybe the sense, a little bit of despair or a bit of feeling that we're getting nowhere. But I think for Friends of the Earth, we're really pushing for these elections. Like, it's a key year in advance, and particularly the European elections, and what Europe can do for climate around fossil fuel dependence, around renewable energy, etc. And we really want to see, we can't tell people how to vote, but I think we want people to think about climate before they go into the ballot and vote in the ballot box. So we're doing as much as we can around informing people's policy, trying to make sure that what people are asking for is faster climate action, but also fair. And I think that came through today very strongly about not leaving people behind. And it's a key part of our work. At the same time, there's council elections, so I know it's less important for some people on this, but also it's really important for us, and we have a climate council pledge. So if people want to contact their local councillors, we've had massive uptake. So I think I'll end today by just saying, while there is a bit of a worry, and we're right to be worried, there's huge energy still out there, and I think we need to really, as groups, need to push on it. And unfortunately, we didn't have some of the main parties today, and we need to be asking them why they're not here, and telling them that climate matters to you. So for us as Friends of the Earth, we're going to build towards the generals as well. So hopefully we'll have some of you maybe not back, some of you back, we don't know, but we'd be looking to engage with you and your parties going forward, to build like a cross-party alliance, because we can't be divided by parties and alliances on this. I think it's too important for all of us. So thanks again, and it's been great. I actually really enjoyed it. So brilliant, and well done. Best of luck to everyone.